do you want to? Whatever you think in terms of timing.
Hi. Shalom Aleichem. How are you? Okay. So, I think we ought to get started in about a minute or so. Got to look in my email for your bio. Okay. Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to a series called Fixing the Rambam. It's a 3-part series featuring a new member of our community, Professor Marc Herman, who moved here over the summer with his wife Debbie and their children. And we're delighted to welcome them to the Bayt community and to Thornhill, and especially to Professor Herman's new position as associate professor at York, assistant professor, at York University. Marc Herman is an assistant professor at York University in the Department of Humanities. His research focuses on the interactions of Jewish and Islamic intellectual history in the medieval Mediterranean, with a particular interest in the overlapping sacred histories of Jews and Muslims. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, he has held postdoctoral fellowships at Columbia University, Fordham University, Harvard University, the University of Michigan, the University of Pennsylvania, and Yale Law School. And so we're really delighted to be able to welcome the Hermans and especially Marc to the community. As soon as I discovered that Marc was going to be teaching at York and that this was his particular area of interest. It happened to be the area of interest that I had studied also at UCLA, and I still am pursuing, medieval Jewish studies, especially in the Islamic world. I got very excited, and I twisted his arm to be able to get to work at helping enhance our own community's education as well as the York University school student education. So I'm really, really delighted that he's agreed to do this for us. I'm grateful, and I look forward to being able to watch the recording of this or listen to the recording of this later, because I have to go teach the Smichas Chaver program. So I wish I could actually be here for this live, but I'll have to catch it on the recording later. So Professor Herman, we're delighted that you're here. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Rabbi Kropkin. Thank you to Marc Mitzkowitz for organizing the series. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully we can make this interesting and worthwhile. So as Rabbi Kropkin mentioned, I'm a historian of the Jews in the Islamic world. Most of my work really focuses not on the material we're talking about tonight, but more on the theorization of the law, how Jews thought about revelation, how they thought about the world around them, and how they constructed that world in light of the rabbinic past and other sort of contemporary inputs from their thinking about God, about revelation, about the rabbis, and those kind of issues. So this project, or so how did I get interested in the picture you see here, which is a picture, as we'll talk about a little bit tonight, a little bit next week, a page from the Rambam's own manuscript, that is what he wrote with his own hand, probably, of the commentary on the Mishnah, is that, of course, the Rambam is the most systematic thinker and the best preserved thinker that we have from the medieval Islamic world. And as anyone who's familiar with the Rambam's writings has experienced, oftentimes he'll address the same issues in different works. And it's very interesting to compare them, right? Sometimes he'll say the same thing, and that itself is significant. It shows sort of how he's stable and how his views didn't really change over time. And other times he'll say something totally different. And he'll say something totally new, and we can see from that, oh, look, he changed his mind. He wrote something when he was young, and he had a new idea. He was exposed to a new way of thinking, something like that. And as I came to realize that each of the Rambam's writings really preserves a different stage of his thinking, and I backed into this larger topic of how to think about and how the Rambam worked. That is, how did he write his books? How did he make mistakes in his own mind? How did he fix them? And how did he change his mind and ultimately become the figure that we know and admire? I recently heard a quotation that struck me from the French theorist Jacques Derrida when he said, when he was studying Aristotle in graduate school, they opened the seminar and said, oh, what do we know about Aristotle's life? Well, we know that he was born, that he thought, and then he died. Everything else, it's just details. Right? That we sort of have that image sometimes of great rabbis, certainly of the Rishonim, that all we really know about them is that obviously they lived, obviously they died, and obviously they produced what they produced, but that's basically it. But lo and behold, we know much more about the Rambam than perhaps we would have realized for lots of reasons that we'll talk about in the next few weeks. And in light of his proximity to what is known as the Cairo Geniza, that is a collection of medieval manuscripts from Cairo, where the Rambam lived the bulk of his life and died, and for other reasons, we really know so much about him. So the goal then, what I hope to do for the next few sessions is to introduce you to these writings and to what we can know about the Rambam. So the first thing that we should know is that obviously it is not some great insight of mine or anyone living in the 20th century that the Rambam changed his mind, right? If you look, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between the sources in front of you and the PowerPoint. But obviously, if we look in these are just a few assorted passages from the commentaries on the Mishnah Torah, right? Sources 1, 2, and 3, right? We can see that the traditional commentaries on the Rambam were well aware that the Rambam changed his mind. Sometimes they had good things about this, and sometimes they didn't, right? So if you look in source number 1, right, this is a Ravid from Hilchot Nizkei Mamon in the Mishnah Torah, right? He says, someone can read this. I don't know. I don't want to do all the talking. Someone want to read source number 1 for us, just in English. Please. Yeah.
Abraham ben David Ravid, says Abraham, it seems to me that this entire topic cannot be saved from error. Perhaps he changed his mind here because he was unsure if the law follows Rav or Shmuel. Above, he ruled according to Rav, and here, like Shmuel. Either way, there are errors here. Right.
So we don't have to necessarily agree with the Ravid's reading of this particular passage in the Mishnah Torah, right? Obviously, the job of the Nosei Kelim, which the commentaries on the Mishnah Torah, is to defend the Rambam and to understand what he's doing. But the Ravid thinks, at least, that it's very plausible that at one point the Rambam held one position, and another time he had a different position. We have similar statements from other commentaries on the Rambam. Some are a little bit more respectful than the Ravid was. Who wants to take source number 2 from Yosef Karo in the Kesef Mishnah, please?
Rabbi Yosef Karo, Kesef Mishnah, Hilchos Kalayim. Our master wrote in Farish HaMishnah like the Ravad, but here he changed his mind because of the Yerushalmi.
Right, so you don't need to know the details of this debate, but basically in the Mishnah Torah we have a debate between the Rambam and his most famous critic, the Ravid, right there on the printed page. And the Kesef Mishnah, Yosef Karo points out that if you look at the Parish HaMishnah, right, the commentary on the Mishnah, which the Rambam wrote before the Mishnah Torah, we see that he actually held a different position, and then he came to take, like the Ravid did, and then he came and changed his mind, right? And even we have again another more general statement in the Magid Mishnah, which is another important commentary on Hilchot Shchita. Right, this is actually not written by the person we usually think of as the author of the Magid Mishnah, but probably somebody else. But he makes a very similar important point. Who wants to take source number 3 for us?
This way?
Yeah, that doesn't matter. Yeah, just read the text itself. You don't need the title.
A great principle to take with you. In many matters, the Mishnah Torah reflects changes to the Parish Mishnah.
Right. So we have just another stray comment from commentaries on the Rambam that say, oh, by the way, the Rambam changed his mind a lot of times. Right. So this is something that's not a new idea. Right. It's very obvious. Should be obvious to all of us if someone is as productive as the Rambam and wasn't a stable thinker. Someone clearly rethought things over the course of his life. we in fact know that he probably changed his mind and rethought things as he went. In fact,
He didn't go back and correct?
don't worry, we'll get there. In fact, the first person to note that the Rambam changed his mind was none other than the Rambam himself. Right here you see a tshuva from the Rambam, written not in Hebrew but in Judeo-Arabic, which is the Rambam's primary language of writing. The Rambam lived in the Arabic world. He wrote in almost all of his works not in Hebrew but in Arabic and Hebrew characters, what we like to call today Judeo-Arabic. Right? The only works he actually wrote in Hebrew were the Mishnah Torah and certain letters. Depending if someone would write him in Arabic, he would respond in Arabic. If someone wrote him in Hebrew, he would respond in Hebrew. That was sort of how people worked in the medieval period. But the Rambam himself tells us, makes this very point. Someone want to read source number 4 for us, which from a tshuva from the Rambam.
What is written in the Chibur.
Yeah, that's the Rambam's word for the Mishnah Torah, right? You just called it the Chibur very often.
Correct without doubt. What you have is the first edition. After we examined and explored the issues, it became clear that what we wrote in the Chibur is correct. So we fixed the Parish HaMishnah.
Right. So the Rambam this idea that the Rambam changed his mind is not some idea that people came up with after the Rambam's lifetime. The Rambam himself, right, tells us, you have an old edition of my work. I went back and changed it. Right. You have the first edition, or the first quote unquote published edition, whatever that means before time of print. Right. The first edition that was spread to the masses. And then I went back and changed my mind. And we'll get back. This very case actually will become important next week. But we have a lot of evidence that the Rambam changed his mind. Right? And this is not something new. This is not a new insight of scholarship from the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. But what is new is the following. Is that with the discovery of the manuscripts that comprise what is known as the Cairo Geniza, right, we have a whole different picture of the Rambam. It's not just that we have these final drafts, you have to compare, and we say, maybe he changed his mind. We look at the final product here and the final product there, and they're totally different things. With a discovery of the Cairo Geniza, we have manuscripts like this, which are not final drafts, but first drafts. Right? So this actually is a first draft of the commentary of the Mishnah on Masechet Shabbat, chapter 2. We'll talk about one small passage from this next week. All right? This is the kind of thing that preserved for us. This is difficult to read. The Rambam, when he was writing for himself, would write in what is known as quick cursive, write very, very fast, in a pretty standard way people would write quickly in his day. But more interesting, right? And in this draft of the Parish HaMishnah, we see things like this. Sorry, go back. This is a draft. But not only do we have a draft, we also have the Rambam's own copy of the Parish HaMishnah, to which he made a lot of changes, right? Countless changes throughout this massive work. Right? We have 5 of the first 6 volumes, of the 6 volumes of the Mishnah that belong to the Rambam himself, right? And in this text, the Rambam actually made changes to the text itself. So here we have a very simple change of arguably great consequence. We'll talk about probably in session number 3, right? It's just zoom in here. I don't know if I can read the words that are crossed out here, but those words are ve'ein, right? And the next word is halacha. And if you read on, Rabbi Shimon, right? So the first draft of, or the draft of the Rambam's own manuscript said, ein halacha Rabbi Shimon. We don't hold like Rabbi Shimon. And then he made a very simple change, as the Rambam would do when he wanted to change his mind. He did as subtly as possible. He changed it from ve'ein halacha Rabbi Shimon to halacha Rabbi Shimon. Takes one little cross out, just cross out one word, right? The law is not like Rabbi Shimon, to the law is like Rabbi Shimon. That's it. Yeah.
Good question. How do we have his personal volumes?
We'll talk about that more, but I'll say very briefly, this basically stayed in the family for hundreds of years. Until the 16th century or 17th century when it was eventually transferred to the libraries at Oxford. So we have a family tradition. There's a long debate. We'll talk about that next week, exactly where this came from. Everyone knows it's the Rambam's personal edition. There's some small details that people argue about, but it's clear that this is his own edition. In fact, we know all these things largely because who else would cross things out? People are not crossing out words in the Rambam. It's not something people do, right? Only the Rambam. That's why the title of this series is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's not, who would fix the Rambam other than the Rambam? Right? Here you see another passage in the Parish HaMishnah and Tzvachim, right? If you look in the bottom lines here, right, the Rambam just crossed out a few words at the end of this line, the end of that line. That's it, right? So this is, instead of not just the final edition, but we can see the Rambam himself actually changing the page. And of course, the image that made up the flyer and the background of this slide, right? This my favorite page from the entire manuscript, which we'll talk about next week as well, right? Here we have the Rambam clearly writing something, thinking it, trying to make a few small changes, right? And then eventually crossing the whole thing out and basically throwing it in the garbage, right? Lucky for us, it survives and is fairly legible, right? To the people who with a trained eye, which is really not that doesn't take a whole lot of training, but right, we see these kind of manuscripts, these kind of texts are something very, very different than just the traditional. Maybe we compare the final copy of the Parish Mishnah to the final copy of the Mishnah Torah, we see a contradiction, right? It's much more than just that. It's much more than just the contradiction between the work. Now we can actually, in light of the Cairo Geniza, in light of other manuscripts that survive, we have evidence from the Rambam himself about how he thought through these works. In fact, we have other things as well. This is an interesting text. Right here we have a draft of the Mishnah Torah as well. Right? We don't have drafts of any of the works, of the whole thing top to bottom. We just have a few stray pages that made their way largely into the Cairo Geniza. Right? But here you see the draft of the Mishnah Torah Hilchot Schirut. We'll talk about this manuscript a bunch tonight. Right? Here you see a chapter heading. Right? And then the Rambam writing some halacha and crossing out and changing his mind and working through the development of the Mishnah Torah. So this obviously also tells us a lot more. The closer we read the text, we can see the Rambam thought this, he changed his mind, he formulated it a different way. It's a whole different perspective, right? Let's just talk about this text for 1 second. Anyone want to give a stab at what this might say up top? I know it's tricky. See what letters you can make out here. We know this is a chapter heading. What is the first word probably? Perek, right? Exactly. Shmini. And you know what this was? That's Shmini. It's not Shmini. What's that last letter? That's a Yud. You don't know what that letter might be?
Nun Yud?
No, it's not. It looks like a Nun, but there's a line. That line next to it is attached. That's an Ayin, right? So what word would this be then? Perek Revi'i or Perek. In this case, it's Perek Shi'i, right? 9th chapter, right? You see it on the page in front of you, right? Source number 5, right? This is Perek Shi'i in the draft of the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Schirut. Okay? Seems pretty simple enough, but lo and behold, we open our copies of the 9th chapter of Hilchot Schirut in the Parish Mishnah, in the okay, hold on 1 second. Let's go back before we go there. What does this say? Anyone want to even just clearly the crossed out words didn't make it in? Anyone can we make a stab on this? This might be a little bit trickier. Hapolim, right? That's the first word. You see it on the page. I copied it on the Hebrew for you, right? Hapolim shed osim b'davar shegidulo min haaretz, right? So we see the word hapoalin. We can make out with some of those letters. That's the Rambam's very distinctive hey. That's a pei. That's a vav. That's an ayin lamed yod nun, right? Shehein osim b'davar shegidulo min haaretz, right? Okay, so that's how the Rambam thought. Presumably, we would start the 9th chapter of Hilchot Schirut. Anyone actually know the 9th chapter of Hilchot Schirut off the top of their head? It does not start like that, right? It does not. Our copies of the Mishnah Torah, the final copy, when we turn to the 9th chapter, we don't have Hapolin shed osim b'davar shegidulo min haaretz. Our chapter 9 starts Hasocher et Hapolin v'amar lahem lahashkim v'chulei v'chulei, right? A whole different subject. But when you turn to chapter 12, it does have this very phrase, Hapolin shein osim davar shegidulo min haaretz. What does that tell us about how the Rambam, what happened here? What is this, chapter 9? It was a cut and paste. It was started as chapter 9. It became chapter 12, right? Not surprising at all to anyone who's ever written anything, right? But at least I think totally remarkable, right? Amazing. We can look back at Hilchot Schirut and say it was not originally structured, right? Without doing any other work. All we can say is it was not originally structured the way we have it now. What we have in chapter 12 was actually originally chapter 9. Now, why is that? How did that come about? That's a whole different story that requires a lot more digging, right? But I just want to give you a taste of the kind of things we can see in these manuscripts and how they work, right?
But it's the same thing, except it's stretched out to change.
The text is very similar, right? But you can see, obviously, when it started, right, he had a different opening words to the chapter that he crossed out, right? And the whole chapter, if we just go back to that, this whole chapter, when it started, looked totally different. Obviously, the final product when it left the Rambam's hand eventually.
Allah were the same for both.
There were a lot of similarities and some differences. Yeah, we'll talk about some of that towards the end, right? I'm just giving you a sense of what we have. Okay, and here you see what became Perek Shi'i became chapter 12. Okay, All right, one other. So when we're dealing then with the Rambam's works, I think it's very important to sort of get ourselves grounded, right? Historians obviously like dates and times and places, get things a little firm. And so what do we need to do then before we sort of delve into understanding, A, how the Rambam worked, and perhaps more interestingly, how and why he changed his mind over time? We need to just get a little sense of the major works that he produced, right? There were, the Rambam writes, several halakhic works. He started off as a younger man writing sort of essentially a riff on the Talmud Yerushalmi, known as the Hilchot Yerushalmi. He tells us that he wrote some commentaries on the Talmud, some of which we have. There's a little bit of a question about some of the details, whether or not they belong to the Rambam. Obviously, the major works that he composed that were lasting contributions to the Jewish bookshelf were three in terms of halacha, right? The Perush HaMishnah, the commentary on the Mishnah, Sefer HaMitzvot, Book of the Commandments, and the Mishnah Torah, right? The first two are in Arabic, the last one in Hebrew, and obviously he wrote several tshuvot, and those can be dated at any time. But I want to talk to you about a little bit how we know what we know, but to be able to date these works, so that we can then build on that to think about how the Rambam would have changed his mind. But obviously we need to get from point A to point B to point C, we need to know what points A, B, and C are. Okay, so the easiest work to date, although this is a little more complicated than it may seem, is actually the Perush HaMishnah, the Rambam's first major halakhic compendium. Right? This is a work that is the first magnificent, complete, real commentary on the Mishnah that we have, written in Arabic. And the way that scholars date these things is the easiest way is when the author tells us when he is working, right? And if you actually look in manuscripts, we always look at the very, very end. It's one of the first things people look at. That is something known as a colophon, right? That is when the scribe or the author, or sometimes if it's the same person, will tell you who he is, usually almost always he, and where he lived, when he was working, etc. Sort of the situation of what produced the book. The custom was to put it all at the very, very end, right? And while we don't have the originals of Seder Taharot of the Perush HaMishnah, the last part of the Mishnah, we actually have relatively early colophons from other manuscripts. Here you see one from the 15th century, another one also from the late 15th century. It looks a little bit nicer, right? But these texts basically agree with what the Rambam agree with each other, telling us they probably are just very well copied from the original source. And if you look here, I've just taken from Yosef Kafech's edition of the Perush HaMishnah, right? We look in source number 6, right, where we can read what the Rambam tells us. Someone want to take source number 6, just in English for us? Please, yeah.
Perush HaMishnah Colophon.
Oh, yeah.
I, Moses, son of Maimon the judge, son of Rabbi Joseph the sage, son of Rabbi Isaac the judge, son of Rabbi Joseph the judge, son of Rabbi Ovadia the judge, son of Rabbi Shlomo the Rav, son of Rabbi Ovadia the judge.
Right, so he's very proud of his lineage here, right? As I guess we would all be if this was us, right?
For all the holy ones for blessing, began to compose this commentary when I was 23 years old. I completed to in Egypt when I was 30 years old, which is the year 1479, 4928 AM, 1167, and 8 CE.
Correct, right. So thank you very much. So let's take a step back. So 1167, 68, that's a date that we sort of at the tip of our tongues. We're sort of familiar, I guess if you really were in a pinch, could figure out what 4,928 was in the Jewish year. Does anyone know what 1479 is referring to? Anyone know? This is Leminyan Shtarot. If you ever look at pre-modern documents, they would date them according to the Ptolemaic calendar, which is about 311, 312 years off from our calendar. This is a standard way of dating things in the medieval age, in the medieval period. And the Rambam obviously did this as well. So what is this? So we actually can glean a lot from this line. Besides the fact that Rambam was very proud of his lineage, and we can identify going very far back in the Maimonides family, right? Based on this list. What else can we tell? What does this tell us about the dates of? Well, first of all, what year was the Perush HaMishnah finished? When was he finished? 1167, 68, right? So we just say 1168 just to be sure. That's I guess the majority of the Jewish year. 4928 was 1168, right? So we have 1168 was our date of completion of the Parashah Mishnah. That sounds very nice. How old was the Rambam? 30. When did he start writing it? At age 23. So what year did he start writing it? Who's a math major in here? 1161. And what year was the Rambam born according to this text? 1138, right? So if we can trust this work, which we probably can, although we may need to be suspected it's a little bit like sort of, it might be that the Rambam sort of rounding year, like 30, maybe he's 29, maybe he's 31. It's hard to really know, right? But give or take, we can say the Rambam was born, therefore, in 1138. When he was the ripe young age of 23, he started working on this work. It took him 7 years. 7 years that were not quiet years in the Rambam's life. We know that he fled Spain sometime in his teenage years, was living in North Africa for a period of time, traveled, made a well-known trip to Eretz Yisrael, and then before arriving in Spain, sometime in the mid 1160s, 1164, 1165. Those are busy years of the Rambam's life. And then finally, a few years after arriving in Spain, finished this work that he'd been working on for a few years already. Yeah?
When he says 23, does he mean 23 like us, or are you born in your first year?
It's hard to know. It's a good question. That's why we have to sort of, maybe it's give or take, right? Sometimes you'll see, very often you will see the year 1135 for the Rambam's birth. That's based on other evidence that's less strong than this. The Rambam himself is telling us this is what we sort of have to go with. This is the most reliable date we have. So then, therefore, it's very easy to date the Parashah Mishnah. We have 1168 it was finished, 1161 it was started, in Egypt, done and done. That's very easy. The other writings from the Rambam are not that simple. When it comes to the Mishnah Torah, we have a whole slew of different kinds of evidence. Some evidence comes from outside of the Mishnah Torah, from the Rambam himself. Right? The best evidence here is going to be from the Rambam himself. Right? This is from a letter a series of letters the Rambam wrote to the Chachmei Lunil. Right? Anyone familiar with the Mishnah Torah will often know that there were a couple dozen tshuvot that the Rambam sent to southern France. There were questions asked of him from the sages of Lunil, mostly headed by a group by Yonatan Mei Lunil, right? And the Rambam then tells us is discussing these works, right? And so here in the opening to this letter, which you see a manuscript of right here, the Rambam discusses what he did and how long he worked on the Mishnah Torah. Someone want to read source number 7, just to give us a ballpark for how long the Mishnah Torah took. Yep.
I've told day and night for about 10 years.
Right. So we know that it took about 10 years, right? It probably finished, we assume, although it's hard to really know, we can assume perhaps that it was finished, that he started only after he finished the Parashah Mishnah, right? So we have 10 years, give or take, around 1178. That's our sort of ballpark to start, okay? Another source. We look similarly, we have a series of letters, a number of questions that were also sent to the Rambam, not from southern France, but in this case from Tyre in Lebanon, to Rabbi Ephraim of Tsur. Tsur is the medieval Hebrew word for the city of Tyre, right? This series of letters speaks about the Mishnah Torah as if it's a work that's already fairly well known, or at least parts of it were known, to the Rambam's correspondence. And what date do we have here? Someone want to take source number 8 for us?
These are all the questions that Rabbi Ephraim asked. All of what you asked, we answered. Sivan 1488 of documents 4937, 1177.
Right. So we have 11. Now we have the year 1177. It's source number 8 of another date that would provide us for the Rambam's for the Mishnah Torah being more or less accessible to the public, and therefore we can assume more or less finished. So therefore that gives us, if we say from 1167, 1168, 67, 68, plus or minus 10 gets us to the late 1170s. That's good. What about internal evidence from the Mishnah Torah itself? So here we have a whole slew of dates that are scattered in various places, right? I've just put them in order here. And some of them, and obviously there are sort of two areas that the Rambam will need to discuss the date when he's talking about halakha, right? The first pertains to the calculation of the calendar, right? Just how do we figure out, the 19-year cycle, and how do we figure out when the new year is, right? All those basic halachot that are technical, even for specialists, right? The Rambam was certainly an expert in his material, right? More than most halachists of the medieval period, certainly. The Rambam really knew astronomy quite well and applied it to understand his understanding of halacha, right? So that's one area. And the second is a related topic. Did anyone know what else would be important for figuring out what year it is? Shemitah, right? That also comes up here, right? Shemitah, you need to know if you want to understand what to do, right? You need to know what year Shemitah is, right? Which actually is a good one. There's a big debate in the Rishonim about the actual dating of Shemitah. It says the Rambam offers a date and says, no, but I'm going to actually follow the Gaonim. And the Ravid says, no, actually the Rambam's right. So that's the only time you can, as far as I know, in the Mishnah Torah where the Rambam doesn't hold like the Rambam and the Ravid does hold like the Rambam. But that's neither here nor there. If you look at these passages just systematically, and then the other place that we would look for, the other place the Rambam offers a date is in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, right? So I've just put the dates up here on the page, right? We don't need to read all these sources inside. In source number 9, in chapter 9 of Kiddush HaChodesh, the Rambam gives us the date 1170. In Shemitah V'Yovel, chapter 10, he gives us the year 1176 as the year that he seems to be writing in. In his introduction, he says 1177. And later in Kiddush HaChodesh, chapter 11, 2 chapters later, he says 1177, right? As dates that he is using. So these would seem to be the sort of ballpark range that the Rambam will be working in, right? It is interesting, and I'm not quite sure what to do with this. A lot of this still is a work in progress. I hope that's okay. I'm not quite sure what to do with this, but it is very interesting that the Rambam would not have tried to make this consistent, right? He didn't go at the end and say, oh, by the way, let's all get these dates all together. No, he just wrote what he wrote, and he did this and sort of left these dates in as sort of evidence, right? It is very interesting that Kiddush HaChodesh gives the date of 1170. That is really early, right? I don't know what order. We still haven't figured out what order the Rambam worked in. Kiddush HaChodesh is not where I would start. Maybe he did. Who knows, right? But it's interesting that only, and then two chapters later, he gives a date 7 years later, right? So clearly he's not writing this in order. It didn't take him 7 years to get 2 chapters, and the rest of it, in a matter of months. So clearly things are being put together piecemeal in a way that we still need to investigate. I'm not sure we can really answer, but perhaps. But that gives us a good ballpark for the Mishnah Torah from 1170 to 1178. And then that sort of matches with our years from our letters to Ephraim of Tzur, 1178, and a letter to Yonatan Milunil, which gives us about 10 years. So this is what we sort of know about the dates of the Mishnah Torah from the early 1170s, maybe a little bit earlier, about 10 years, gets us to the late 1170s, right? 1178, maybe 1180. It's hard to really know any more precision than that, but that's sort of what we're thinking about and what scholars generally assume or have concluded about the dating of the Mishnah Torah. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, so I have a question. So do we have samples from each of those dates that are listed of his actual hand?
No. But we have the best. If we look at early manuscripts, and as long as manuscripts are sort of consistent with each other, we can assume they came from a common source. That's how it works.
So it's interesting because I noticed that from the first one, like the big one that you showed the
Yeah.
crossing out, if you look at the script and the other sample of the handwriting, the script, it seemed to look very different.
Yes. Yeah. The handwriting is very different, right? We'll talk about that. But in brief, right, the Rambam, when he was writing for himself, would write in a certain way, and he was writing for something that would be shared publicly, would do a little more professional copy. And it seems, this is a little bit harder to show with confidence, but it's pretty clear that at the end of his life, he wasn't able to do that quite clear handwriting, which makes sense. As a older person, would have a weaker hand, perhaps. We can sort of tell that some of the later additions to some of these texts were made by a sort of shaking hand. Yeah, that's very, very interesting.
Or did he have a scribe that worked for him?
He certainly did, but it seems in all likelihood that, certainly the drafts he wrote himself. And the question is, the copyist question remains to be talked about. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. Okay.
Where was he living at this time?
In Cairo. In Fustat, in Old Cairo, which is Fustat.
From Spain?
Yes, all these works are produced in Egypt, finalized in Egypt.
And he was working as a doctor full time.
He was certainly trained as a doctor. Whether he was a full-time doctor at this stage, unclear. Probably not. He tells us that at some point that he was supported by his brother, who was a diamond and pearl trader, I think, to India. And then when his brother's ship sunk, that sort of led him to have to work more. So there was seems to have been a period of the Rambam's life where he wasn't working professionally and was able to sort of be in learning, I guess we would say today.
Rotev and Timmons don't come because they're too busy.
That's a much later. That's later, yeah. Okay, yeah. All right. And what about the Sefer HaMitzvot? This turns out actually to be the most difficult of these works to date because we have no dates. It seems to be intimately connected to the Mishnah Torah in content, right? But there are a lot of contradictions between the Sefer HaMitzvot and the Mishnah Torah, and which sort of leads people to question how closely together they were produced. Although there are, of course, other explanations for contradiction. But if you look in the introduction to the Sefer HaMitzvot, right, the first thing the Rambam writes is, I just finished the Parashah Mishnah, or I finished the Parashah Mishnah, everyone knows about it, right? So which tells us that it was written after the Parashah Mishnah. Okay, not a great piece of evidence, but it certainly tells us that it was not an early work. But if we actually look in the Rambam's own manuscript of the Parashah Mishnah itself, there are two references to the Sefer HaMitzvot. Okay, one is in Menachot. It's on the side of the page. I'm very impressed with my own PowerPoint skills here. It's a little bit difficult to read, but here you see this comment is put in the side, which means that it's a later comment, right? And the Rambam says in source number 14, right? He talks about in the past tense, as I have explained in the commentary on the Mishnah. As I have explained in the Sefer HaMitzvot. So the fact that he's writing about the Sefer HaMitzvot in the past tense, in a later comment on the manuscript of the Parashah Mishnah, tells us that this comment was written after the Sefer HaMitzvot was completed, right? Logical. So this tells us that this would seem to indicate the Sefer HaMitzvot sort of came later, right? He wrote the text in the middle of the page here, and then came back and changed it with reference to the Sefer HaMitzvot when he came back and changed his mind. But the other passage in the Parashah Mishnah that refers to the Sefer Mitzvot is not that simple. Here, in the middle of the page, right, he again refers to his book, and this is in Arabic, so don't worry if you can't understand it. My book about the commentary, about the counting of the commandments, right? So he's clearly has this book in mind. But the problem here is how do we exactly read this phrase? Someone want to read source number 15 who hasn't taken a turn reading yet? Please.
As is / will be explained in my book on the enumeration of the mitzvahs.
Right. So it's not clear in this passage how do we translate the verb, right? Is it that I've already written it and therefore it would be strange that it's in the middle of the page, right? Then that would totally throw our dating out of whack. Or does it mean that I will explain it, he had it in mind? Right, probably the latter, but it's also possible that this manuscript itself may sort of been produced even after the work was written. It's a little bit complicated figuring out how this all works and how we would sort of date all these works because of this comment. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the Parashah Mishnah more in depth next week.
It has both words in there, right?
No, what do you mean? Then at the slash? No, there's a translation. That's a translation from the Arabic. It's unclear how to translate the Arabic word. Is it the present tense or the future tense? Yeah, it's not clear whether it's the present tense or the future tense, right? Okay. All right. So that is our world of dating, right? We can now, with a fair degree of confidence, date these three major works, right? Two of them with pretty firm dating, and one of them not as much, right? We could date the Parashah Mishnah to have been finished, the Rambam tells us by 1168. We're not clear what that means. Finished means, right? But we have 1168 for that, and we have in the late 1170s, give or take 1178, 1180 for the Mishnah Torah, and the Sefer Mitzvot was sometime in the middle, right? Sefer Mitzvot is not as big, obviously, as the Mishnah Torah, just one volume, right? And it wouldn't have taken quite as long, but it's somewhere in the middle between the Parashah Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah. Okay, so if we're sort of putting the Rambam's works in order, which we'll need to know for moving forward in the next couple of weeks, that's the order that we would do it. Okay, so what I want to do with the remainder of the time is just show you a few of the kinds of things that we can glean from these changes that the Rambam made to his writings. And some of them are simple, and some of them are a little bit complex. but hopefully they will all become clear. Obviously, these are halakhic manuals, so they're going to be dealing with matters of halacha. But before we get to some of the intricacies, I just want to show you this page, or this series of pages, that was just published a couple years ago. This is not from one manuscript. What's amazing about what some Geniza scholars can do today, and some of this is done with the aid of technology, some just people are really smart, but you can see this is not one page, right? This what reassembled draft of Hilchot Malveh Velove, right, another section of Mishnah Torah, was actually reassembled from little teeny tiny pieces, right? And once this sort of 1,000-year-old puzzle was reassembled, and the publisher of the article, Hanan Ariel, who teaches, I think, at Tel Aviv University, was able to get a sense of what this text is, and it turns out not just to be some random puzzle, but actually a draft from the Rambam's copy of Hilchot Malveh Velove. And there's a lot of things that are interesting in this text. We don't have time to go through all of them, but one of them really stuck out to me when I first read this article, and that's the following. If you look in this little mark, this may look like squiggles, but does anyone know what language this is?
Chinese?
It looks like Chinese, but if you turn it to the other side, you turn it 90 degrees, that is actually in Arabic. That's an Arabic notation that the Rambam wrote on his own draft of Hilchot Malveh Velove, right? And what does it mean? It just means move, like copy and paste. Take this sentence, put it somewhere else, right? Not a major surprise. We know already the Rambam had a draft and he moved things around from the draft, as most of us do when we're writing, right? Not at all surprising. What is amazing to me, at least, is that this is not in Hebrew. It's not even in Judeo-Arabic, meaning Arabic and Hebrew characters. It's actually the Rambam writing in Arabic characters.
Rambam never wrote in Arabic?
He wrote in Arabic, but he wrote most of the writings we have are in Hebrew characters in Arabic. So what's interesting to me here is when he was writing for himself, at least in this one instance, and probably we can make some larger comments about this, he didn't write sort of notations, at least in this instance, in Hebrew. He wrote it in Arabic characters, which I think tells us something about sort of the Rambam's preference, linguistic preference, right? Something he grew up speaking, someone speaking around him, was not Hebrew but Arabic, and when he was sometimes writing notes to himself, instead of writing in Hebrew, he would sometimes write in Arabic and in Arabic characters. So that stuck out to me, very interesting. The kinds of things we can say from this material. But I want to just focus more on the halakhic material and what the Rambam can tell us. So this manuscript, which is source number 16, is also another draft, right? This is the draft of the introduction to Sefer Mishpatim. Okay? This is a simple question. How many books are in the Mishnah Torah? 14, right? It's known as the Yad Chazakah. This was the name given to it, not by the Rambam, but by people who didn't like the name Mishnah Torah, because they felt it was a problematic title, right? Because what is Mishnah Torah really? Sefer Dvarim, right? So what right does the Rambam have to call his own book after one of the Chumashim? So they came up with the title was given Yad HaChazakah, right? Yad being the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah, right? So this is just a draft from the introduction to Sefer Mishpatim. So let's take a look at what he writes here. Okay, this is a little bit trickier to read. So let's take a look from just on the page. This says, I want to read this at source number 16 for us. Anyone see?
Book 11, that is Sefer Mishpatim.
Right, so this is just the heading you would give, right? Seemingly very simple. Book number 11, Sefer Mishpatim. Does that jump out to anyone as surprising? It should in a second. Okay, so that's the beginning. So he writes, Sefer Mishpatim there's Sefer Mishpatim. This is book number 11 of the seemingly 14, although we're not, maybe not at this stage. It's hard to say. How many, and it's of course within Sefer Mishpatim or within any of the books of the Yad, they're divided into subsections, right? Known as halachot, right? Sefer Hamadah, the first one, Hilchot Yusei Torah, right? And v'chulei, right? It has subsections known as halachot, right? So in this draft, does anyone tell us how many sections there were in Sefer Mishpatim? What does he say? 14 sections, and this right. There are 14 sections, right? That's about here. And then he tells us that he's going to write. This is where you should put in the list of sections. right? And instead of writing a list of sections, the Rambam says, write sections here, right? And instead of writing them in Hebrew, he writes them in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, in Hebrew characters, which is another piece of evidence that the Rambam himself would be more comfortable, perhaps, writing Arabic than Hebrew, right? And then he writes, this I didn't put on the page, but I should have, the number of mitzvot in this book is blank, right? Everyone who's familiar with the Mishnah Torah knows that it starts with a list of the 613 mitzvot, right? And then it says, and then the Rambam tells you, I'm going to make sure that I want to show you that I covered all 613. How do I do that? By saying at the beginning of Sefer Hamadah, this is how many mitzvot are in this book. Sefer Ahava, how many in this one, right? Sefer Mishpatim, how many mitzvot are going to go in here of the 613? The Rambam didn't know yet, okay? And for reasons we'll see in a second. And then on the bottom of the page, the first part of Sefer Mishpatim, according to the in this draft, there is a correction, okay? Here he has the word halachot. Some of these letters might be a little bit easier. We now know this is a hey, this is a lamed, a chaf, vav, and a taf, right? And then he says, this is a little bit trickier to read, although we know that's a kuf, right? From our word perek from before, right? Here this word, it turns out to be hilchot nizakim, right? All the laws of damages. Is there a hilchot nizakim in the Rambam? There is not. Right? The Rambam crossed out Hilchot Nizakim and wrote Hilchot Nizkei Mamon.
Which one is this came up?
Up there. That's the word. You see the word Mamon?
Yes.
That's a kuf, there's a yud, and there's a nun right there. Okay? That's Nizkei Mamon. Right? So the Rambam then changed. Initially, Sefer Mishpatim included this very big thing called Hilchot Nizakim, covering all interpersonal damages. Right? And changed it. No, I'm going to have a subsection for monetary damages and other subsections, right? Instead of following exactly the way the Mishnah has, right? We have to remember that all the Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra are all sort of one Masechet Nizikim for a lot of the Rishonim, right? And so it seems like initially the Rambam had Hilchot Nizikim based on these tractates in the Mishnah, and then invented a new categorization through within Sefer Mishpatim. But there's more. If you look, we actually have a signed copy of the Mishnah Torah of the first two books, Sefer Hamadah and Sefer Ahava, right, are not actually written by the Rambam, but in the manuscript the Rambam writes the following. Can anyone figure what knows what this says? This says, Huga mi sifri, right? This was copied from my own personal work. So the Rambam had someone came in, and we'll see a picture of the manuscript in a second, and copied the Mishnah Torah in order to spread it out, right? So as a proof that it was a good copy, the Rambam signed that copy. He wrote, Hugami Sifri, this copy of the Mishnah Torah that you are holding, that you can read online, is copied from my own personal copy, Ani Moshe Berebi Maimun Zatzal. Right? So we have a copy of the first two books of the Mishnah Torah that the Rambam signed, autographed, if you will, from his own hand, which is evidence of this work. And if we look at this work, we have a table of contents, right? As every copy of the Mishnah Torah starts with, right? A good table of contents, right? This is not every single thing, but this is the beginning. What are those? Sorry, 1 second. Let's go back one slide. What are these books? So we have. Book, what number is, so the Sefer Mishpatim just goes on 2 pages. So right here we have book 12, which is Sefer Kinyan, right? And book 11, does anyone know what that says? Nizikim, right? Sefer Nizikim, I think it's Nizikim with a mem, right? Sefer Shalosh Esar is Sefer Mishpatim. Is that the same as our previous manuscript? What number was Mishpatim in the draft? 11. Here it's number 13. Not only that, instead of having all of Hilchot Nizikim included in Sefer Mishpatim in the beginning, he came up with a new categorization, putting Hilchot Nizikim as his own book. So this tells us, I think, something very interesting. It's hard to know the big ramifications for this, but one of the things that we can tell from this, right, is that the Mishnah Torah had a different structure initially when the Rambam was first writing it. It may not have had 14 books, right? Seemingly not, because Sefer Nizikim was subsumed under Sefer Mishpatim originally, right? And Sefer Mishpatim has a sort of amorphous title, right? I was thinking about, how would you translate the word Mishpatim? It just means laws, right? So it seems to be pretty broad kind of topic, right? And so the fact that the Rambam pulled out Nizikim to make its own book, right, and changed the number from, what do we have, 11 to 13, right, of Mishpatim, shows us a restructuring of the Mishnah Torah. Okay? So let's talk about one last, this is the most involved of our examples. Okay. So let's go back to this text, right? We remember this is Hilchot Schirut, right? Chapter 9, chapter 12. I want to talk about another piece of this. And this requires going to a little bit more maybe traditional reading of sources that we have. Okay, so in Hilchot Schirut, there's obviously a lot of, all the laws pertain to hired workers, right? And to renting objects and hired workers, etc. Okay, one of the mitzvot that comes up, right, is a permission for hired hands on a farm to consume fruit or food that they are working with. So if I get hired to work on a farm, my job is to pick the apples, I'm allowed to eat the apples as I'm working. Okay, that's a sort of general halacha that comes up in the, it's based on a pasuk, but it really comes up in the Mishnah and Bava Metzia. Okay, the problem is, right, as with all halacha, right, figuring out the details and the extent of this allowance can be a little bit tricky. So does someone want to read source number 18 for us from the Mishnah in Bava Metzia? Who wants to read that? Sure, yep.
These may eat by the law of the Torah with what is connected to the ground, when the work is finished, with what is detached until it is finished.
Okay, so when one is working with material that is attached to the ground, mechubar, lekarka, right, you have a permission until during the time of finishing work. Okay, no, I don't know exactly what that means. That's not for now. I want to focus instead on the next line. He tells us, the Mishnah tells us, right, when can until when can a worker eat the produce of fruit that is detached from the ground? The Mishnah says, ad shelo nigmara malachto, right? So there's two different ways to understand what that Mishnah is referring to. Does anyone know what that might be?
The work of the thing or the work of the person?
The work of the thing or the work of the person? So the work of the person seems pretty obvious to understand what that means. So the work of the person means that while he's working, until he finishes working, then he can keep eating, right? Exactly. What does it mean in the work of the thing? This requires a little bit of technical knowledge of Hilchot Zra'im. What is...
Finished being produced.
It's finished being produced. I don't know what that means. What does that mean for us? Anyone know? Well, there's a certain stage of the produce that one becomes chayiv in Trumot and Maasrot, right? If you are a farmer, you don't have to take Trumot and Maasrot immediately. Only at a certain stage, known as Gmar Malacha, right? Whenever that thing is ready or ready to be eaten or finish the work of the field, does one have to separate Trumot and Maasrot, right? So that's known as Gmar Malacha, right? That's why I translated. That's why I have ambiguity in the translation. It means he or it is finished, referring to the worker or referring to the fruit. Now, when we look at the Parasha Mishnah...
But it's interesting, it's special language. Ash lo nigrum lachto. You could have said ash nigru. Out of Avachlau, or he says ash lo right before it's nigru.
Right, so okay.
The translation
The Mishnah, for sure. I agreed. Okay. So when we look in the Parasha Mishnah here, the Rambam is very clear about which position he takes. Right? Does this refer to the worker or the finishing of the fruit? Someone want to read source number 19?
When he is working with detached produce, he may eat while he's working.
Right. So when can you work? What is it referred to in the Mishnah? Is it referring to the fruit or the person? It's very clearly referring to the person. Right. The worker is able to consume fruit as long as he is working. And indeed, when we look at the Parasha Mishnah, the draft of Hilchot Schirut, right, we see something very similar. Someone want to read? This is a little bit tricky. This is a little bit technical to read, but I brought the text on the page here. Who wants to read source number 20 for us?
One who is working with detached produce may consume until he is finished working. When he is finished working, it is forbidden to consume.
Okay, so this is very consistent with the Parasha Mishnah, right? The first draft of Hilchot Schirut, right, is entirely consistent with the view in the Parasha Mishnah. This Mishnah refers to the worker. While the worker is working, he's allowed to eat the fruit, and when he stops working, he has to stop eating. Right? Not a complicated halacha by any stretch of the imagination. But when you look in the Mishnah Torah itself, not the draft, right, you get a whole different picture. And this is not just in printed editions, only in some printed editions. In fact, we have disagreements between many manuscripts about how to read this text and what the Rambam's final wording of this halakha was. Okay? And in many manuscripts and in many most printed versions of the Mishnah Torah, we don't have any change to this halakha. But in a few very trustworthy manuscripts, some that that we can date because of their corrections to very late in the Rambam's life, meaning let's take a step back. We have the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, right? He was working on it his whole life. People would come in at different times in the Rambam's life and copy the text, right? And from those copies, different versions might emerge, right? So if you are coming in 1180 and you're copying it, you're going to get one version. If the Rambam changes his mind in 1190, you're going to get a different version of that text, right? And those two initial differences are then going to filter down into all the copies that are made from those manuscripts, right? Not complicated, but important to understand how these things work. So then when we have different manuscript traditions about what the Rambam held, right, a contradiction between two manuscripts, sometimes, if there's not a mistake, if it's very reasonable, if you have other evidence that would support this, sometimes you can say those two manuscripts actually both reflect what the Rambam held, just at different stages, right? This is most apparent in the Parashah Mishnah, where we have clear corrections in the text. Right? We already saw a bunch of pages where the Rambam crossed things out. And we have some manuscripts that reflect the original draft, what was crossed out, and some manuscripts reflect what was put in its place. Right? So that it's pretty clear those two manuscripts come from original copies that date to these two different stages in the Rambam's life. When it comes to the Mishnah Torah, we don't have the Rambam's own copy of the vast majority of it. We only have certain pages. We only have some of the pages, and other times we have to do this sort of working backwards from the manuscripts that we had. And in this halakha, very convenient, where the Rambam was constantly changing his views within this entire chapter of Hilchot Schirut, right? This very halakha, the Rambam seems to have changed based on this very system, right? We have some manuscripts that seem to reflect an early dating of the Rambam's life, and others that reflect a later dating, right? And here, so therefore, when you read Hilchot Schirut, Parak, chapter 12, halacha number 2, in the printed editions, you may not see this edition. It's preserved, and now, in just recently, past couple of years, published by Rav Yitzchak Shilat, a very careful and critical edition of the Mishnah Torah, and then he prefers this version because it's logical and for reasons we'll see in a second. But so not all of them are going to preserve this text. But what is the text of the Mishnah Torah that seems to be the correct one, the final one that the Rambam read? Who wants to read source number 22 before we get to source number 21? Who wants to read that for us?
One who is working with detached produce may consume until he is finished working. When the fruit is set for masa or for challah, it is forbidden for him to eat.
So according to this, until when can the worker eat? Until what stage?
Until you're done working.
Until the fruit is...
When it's ready for masa.
When it's ready. When it's nigmar malacha, not referring to the gmar malacha, the finishing of the working of the worker, but the gmar malacha of the fruit. Exactly. Right? We saw the ambiguity in the Mishnah, and now we see the Rambam in the draft of the Parashah Mishnah, in the Parashah Mishnah, in the draft of Hilchot Schirut, saying it refers to the worker while he's working, and then in the final copy, right here you see ad shelo nimra malachto lemaaser ulachala. Right? He's clearly changing his mind to reinterpret this Mishnah to refer to not to the worker himself, but the produce, until the produce is finished, and that's when you're allowed to eat it. Okay. Now, this...
Is that necessarily he sells himself? Is that kind of...
It's a different interpretation of the Mishnah. One refers to the worker, and the other refers to the fruit.
But both are true. I mean, if you're not working with it, you can't eat from it. That's always true. That's assumed.
Yeah, but if...
at night, you can't
sure.
just take food in your... That's what he's saying.
Yeah, but if the worker could continue working on it after it's fixed for Meiser, right? Once it's finished...
Fixed for Meiser, there's no work to be done.
I don't know if that's true. I don't think that's true at all. I think that even after Meiser, the worker might still need to be employed, right? What fixed Meiser comes in the house, right? So it comes in the house, now you have to take Meiser, right? But the worker can still continue working with it.
You're saying it is a steal, right?
Yeah, I think it is very clearly. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is. Yeah.
To me, it sounds like it's a clarification that there's really two parts to it. first part is, when the worker stops working for the day, he can't take the fruit home with him. Part B is, well, if it's ready for Meiser or Challah, then he's certainly forbidden from taking it. So I see this just a clarification.
Well, so I'm not sure, because here he says, in the first draft he says, Mishigmar melachto asur le'achol, right? Mishigmara melachto, referring to the worker, and then he says, Mishitigamer avodato lema'aser ulechala, right? He's changing the sort of whole subject of the sentence. Maybe, I'm not sure I see it that way.
English isn't clear.
The English may not be, maybe a little less clear. The English is,
Because it has the
yeah.
lima aser.
Sure, right.
Lima aser.
Right, it's hard to translate. I was sort of mitla beta about how to translate that phrase. Okay, so.
But you're asking a good question. But if he's working with it, why can't he?
Well, he could be finished. Maybe he's done.
He's not done.
Let me
No,
see.
but it seems to be saying,
Yeah.
it's just reminder, even if he's working with
Even if
it.
you're working at it, once it's kabula meiser, you can't
You
consume
can't,
it.
even
That's what it
if
sounds
you're
like.
working with it.
Correct. Yeah, that's what it sounds like from this halacha. Right, that's a lot of Rishonim paskin. And in fact, so this discussion is taken from an article from Professor Shama Friedman, and he suggested that these 3 lines, 3 words, right, melachto d'ma'aser l'chala, reflect a change in the Rambam's thinking based on the influence of the commentary of Rashi on the Gemara. All right, look at source number 21. How does the Rashi understand the Mishnah in Bava Metzia? Not about the worker, but about the completion of the fruit. Right? So there's a big question in scholarship on the 12th century. How fast were Rashi's commentaries spread? Right? When you look at it seems pretty clear that the Rambam didn't know Rashi all that well. Right? The Rambam doesn't refer to Rashi basically ever. There's some suspect sources, but basically doesn't refer to Rashi. We know only in the 13th century did Jews in Egypt and what we know as the Middle East, right, start referring to Rashi as a named figure, right? So, but this change, where the Rambam is apparently adopting the interpretation of Rashi, where it changes mind, it seems like, perhaps, based on the influence of Rashi from on this, how to read this Mishnah, right, may reflect a stage in the Rambam's career where he said, wait a second, this reading of the Mishnah seems to be better than my original one, right? This is only just one example, right? So it's hard to tell a huge story out of this. What Professor Friedman suggested was this seems to reflect Rashi's influence on the Rambam, very small, but very significant nonetheless. Okay? So just to take a step back, so this last piece was suggested by Professor Friedman. I think the argument is very suggestive. Whether it's 100% right about the influence of Rashi remains to be seen, but certainly we see a change, I think, in the developing of the Rambam's thinking about this Mishnah, and we can use that as an example for how to think about the Rambam and his changes in general. So that was all basically introduction, right? I wanted to show you basically what we have, how the Rambam, how we can date this stuff, how we know what we know about the Rambam's writings. And then finally, I would show you just a few examples, none of which are original to me. All the stuff that we saw on page number 3 from Fixing the Rambam is from what other people have discovered. What I want to do in the next couple of weeks is show you my own contributions to this field, right? Next week, I want to talk about the editing of the Parashat Mishnah. Probably have this beautiful, amazing manuscript the Rambam probably wrote and certainly changed in his own hand. And then I want to talk about in the final week, how the Rambam wrote the Sefer Mitzvot and how he changed the Sefer Mitzvot and the Mishnah Torah in light of discussions that he had already produced and was rethinking in the Parashat Mishnah, right? And all of this will be in light of his own manuscripts and other material that we have from that. So that's what I want to cover. Are there any questions? I know that was a lot of material. Yeah, Marc.
I have a more philosophical hashkafa question.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you're learning, and there seems to be something very quizzical that you're coming across, it's written off as a copyist error because the individual involved, Rambam, Rashi, and Ruach HaKodesh, how could they have made an error? So how do we sort of reconcile that? And also, what if he had passed away X number of years earlier and never gotten around to making those changes?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you see contradictions, right? And it's not when the Rambam was fixing his work. And say he discusses something, 3 or 4 times in different places. He didn't always fix every passage, right? So we can see even the Parashat Mishnah, which you have the most access to his own handwriting. Let's say something comes up 2 or 3 times, he will only fix it in one of the discussions, right? And so that could be telling for how we were thinking. Hard to know. of course, the Rambam was a Ma'ayin Mitgaber. He was constantly rethinking things, changing his mind. Doesn't mean anything was wrong to begin with, but it is interesting to see his mind at work. As for Ruach HaKodesh, that is above my pay grade. Yeah.
So, question: was this the way it was approached? Let's say with Rashi or with
Yeah, so that's a question that I can only assume is correct. We don't have a lot of manuscript. We don't have, basically, for none of the Rishonim we can do. No other Rishonim can we do this kind of work. We don't have enough direct evidence from the Rishonim. The closest thing we have is the Ramban's commentary on the Torah, and they're not from the Ramban's own hand, but because we know the Ramban, when he got to Eretz Yisrael, he sort of encountered new ideas. He got a better understanding of geography, and he would change and add to the Perush on the Torah. So there's some manuscripts that have the additions that were later, and some that don't. And that tells us that he changed his mind, and we can sort of figure out some of the development ideas that way. But we don't have this kind of direct evidence from the Ramban's own hand.
It's too bad that he didn't mark final version.
There was no final version. I don't think there was a final version for the Rambam. There's never a final version. It's always a work in progress. I think that's pretty clear. The Perush Mishnah, I keep saying it's finished in 1168, was never finished. Right? It's clear from these works the Rambam kept working at it. Right? He kept thinking. If he came up with a new idea, he saw something that was better. Avram and Rambam tells us a story that when my father was corrected, he would take suggestions from even like the weakest students in his shir.
But they
right?
never numbers of versions, like early.
But you can tell sometimes. You can tell sometimes. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So first of all, we would expect people to do that.
Yeah, for sure. None of this is surprising.
I would expect it.
Yeah.
But B, did any, we have a lot of Dolim with what word? They memorize everything. What's the word?
Photograph? You mean like?
Photographic
Yeah,
memory.
sure.
Take the Lubavitcher Rebbe photographic memory. A lot of Dolim. Did they ever go through these things because they could see all the rock in front of them? Who was the biggest person?
As far as I know, the person who's most interested in stuff, although of the previous generation, Menachem Kasher would have been interested in this kind of material, but some of it was accessible. They didn't have this stuff. It wasn't all that accessible. Only one.
Kaneski saw everything.
So I don't know how they approached. I can't say specifically how they.
These scholars were the ones who were behind this, or they're people who are very smart, but then they have this type of.
I think Yosef Kapach certainly was a Kapach. The editor of the Temani editor of the Rambam's writings was certainly in that league. He sort of was able to see all this stuff. I'm not sure it's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Or nowadays, would they be able to put it like in a computer algorithm to?
The technology to read manuscripts through the way we sort of OCR PDFs is still in the infancy, but it's not beyond sight. It's certainly possible. Yeah, Marc.
When we regular people make errors, there's a couple times. Sometimes you're writing something that's absent-minded, and sometimes you make a correction, and sometimes it's a really thoughtful thing, but you change your mind.
Yeah.
Is his more the thoughtful kind, or did he make absent-minded errors?
I'm sure everyone makes mistakes. Most of these times, what's interesting about these cases, all the cases that I've seen, what's really interesting is that you say you have version 1, 2, and 3. And the Rambam is trying to explain some sugya, let's say. The first version can explain the sugyot. The second version can explain all the sugyot. The third version can also explain all the sugyot. Right? So what's amazing is that each one is totally consistent. And it's not like it's so obvious that why he would say this is wrong. Maybe some are a little bit stronger in certain instances, but ultimately the Rambam could explain at each stage. But he needed to. But he kept thinking and kept reevaluating. Yeah.
Yeah. Did he have an original Rambam that he wrote himself, which is fragments of what he.
So the Perush Mishnah manuscript.
Yeah, but in Mishnah Torah, do we have?
Not the final copy. No, we have this signed copy.
I've seen the copies, in Oxford. And
yeah, so we have the signed copy of the first two volumes,
right.
But that wasn't him writing. Clearly, it was someone else writing. But I don't think we have his own personal copy of the Sefer of the Mishnah Torah. No.
Is that the same for Moreh Nevuchim also?
Yes, as far as we don't have it. We have some drafts of the Moreh Nevuchim.
Right.
We don't have his own copy, but it also seems to have been written in different ways.
Yeah. The same thing.
Same kind of thing. Yeah.
Do we know if we have other Gedolim quoting the earlier versions and basing their opinions on his earlier version?
Yeah, people would, if you look in the printed edition of the standard edition of the Perush Mishnah, which is found in any, Babylonian Talmud of today, is from earlier editions of the Perush Mishnah, and those were the ones that everyone sort of knew. Yeah, for sure. These were, if you look in every time, you have to see what people are quoting, and people have access to what's printed, and what's printed is sometimes based on earlier editions, and so yeah, for sure.
So then you can come out with totally different halacha.
Yeah, not often, but yeah. So I mean, yeah, okay. The Rambam has a machloket. It's okay. Any other?
Are there any major? Maybe this isn't part of this, but translation errors of the Judaic.
I wouldn't say errors. I mean, there are. The problem is that whenever you're translating, you're gonna. The people who knew the translators were all very good, but sometimes they're sort of having to come up with new terms or things not always understood, or something's clearer in the original than they would be. That's sort of standard in any translation, I would think. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I hope we whet your appetite for that. Thank you guys for coming, and I will continue hopefully next week. No, you can. That's all yours.